Did everyone get a red envelope? Have you opened it yet? It's taking its time. Thank you to the ushers for dealing with that. Appreciate it. Well, today's service is in line with the theme for the month, which is justice and equity. And today's service is justice, equality, and equity. And all of those are to do with fairness. But equity is a bit of a buzzword, as you've probably noticed over the last 10 years. And even in the 2020 election, there was a video that went out from the Democratic Party with Kamala Harris explaining what equity was. So at that stage, once you know it's into the political realm, it's okay to be skeptical of equity. But our second principle that was done in 1984 is justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. So Unitarian Universalists have been talking about equity for a long time. But what does it mean? And how is it different from equality? And the basic idea is that equality supports everyone getting the same. Equity is about everyone getting what they need to be similar. And could you put the slide up? And it's in your order of service, this slide. And that's the difference of equality and equity. Like, well, everyone who wants to see over the fence, a tall person like me can see over the fence anyway. So I can empathize and sympathize with this tall person. But then the smaller one who needs a box to get up there, but then the person in the wheelchair, the box is useless. For people with physical disabilities, the box can be useless. So the idea is equity. Well, the person who is tall doesn't need the box. So give 2 boxes to the other person who needs it and build a ramp for the person in the wheelchair who needs the accessibility. And that all looks great. But how does justice work? For me, justice is, why is there a fence there in the beginning? Why is there a fence there? So yeah, equality and equity can be useful to get towards justice. But I think it's very important for us always to be asking, what are the barriers that people need to be lifted up? And people do. There's valid reasons for equity. We know that the education system has been discriminating against historically marginalized groups, African Americans, Latino, for many, many centuries, women. The healthcare system continues to discriminate against many in our community, especially those who lack economic resources. The criminal justice system, the percentage of people of color who are in jail is vastly disproportionate to the representation in wider society. So we know there's a need for more equality. We know there's a need for more equity. But what I think justice requires is, how can we remove the barriers? Because I think we generally believe in equality of opportunity. But equality of opportunity does not mean everyone gets the same thing. Equity asks us, like, how can we give more people what they need to have more opportunity? And as importantly, how can we remove the barriers that stop people moving forward? Because we know the poverty trap, that we do not help people to get out of poverty. And we look at what's happening in Redwood City around affordability for housing. How do we remove the barriers to get everyone into housing? We see it in San Francisco with the homeless population, but the homelessness is everywhere. It's not just in the cities, though we like to blame the cities. We can walk down to Sequoia Station, and we can see that here in Redwood City. And Faith in Action, I've brought a proposal that they're putting on the ballot to give renters more rights to stop them being evicted. And that's a beginning of moving some of the barriers that are there, and it's a step towards equity, but more importantly, it's a step towards justice. And in our social action committee, we often talk about there really needs to be 3 components to our justice work. There needs to be the social service where we connect with people. But there also needs to be education around the issues. And most importantly, there needs to be advocacy. Because advocacy is what changes the system. Because too often the social services like food banks and clothes distribution, they don't really change the system. In some ways, they perpetuate the system. That's not to say we shouldn't do it. We need to help people in their desperate need, but we also need to advocate to change and remove those barriers, remove that fence that stops people having access to resources, because too many people in our society are under-resourced. Dr. John Perkins, who's an African-American Christian minister, he said, "You've heard the old saying, give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, teach him to fish, and you feed him for a lifetime." But John Perkins goes on to say, we've got to ask, who owns the pond? Who polluted the pond? Who built the gates up? And why does a fishing license cost so stinking much? That is advocacy. That is tearing down the fence. That is asking the right questions to drive our justice work. That's a step towards equality. That's a step towards equity. And most importantly, that's a step towards justice. It's not easy. The Catholic Archbishop Helder Camara, he died in the 1990s. He was a Brazilian Catholic Archbishop. He says, when I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why they are poor, they call me a communist. Because equity and equality and justice threatens power. And so people will resist. We all give up our power. And Ejimo Ojulu, who's an African-American writer, says, when we identify where our privilege intersects with someone else's oppression, we find the opportunities to make real change. Where we recognize where our privilege intersects with another's oppression, that's where we can make real change. I'm not trying to make us feel guilty, but we have to realize how are we complicit in systems? How are we complicit in building up fences that stop people seeing the baseball game, that stop people getting out the poverty trap, that stop people access to healthcare, that stops greater equity in our religious education system? That is justice and equity. That is the work as Unitarian Universalists that we are called to do, and we need to do it together.